Thank you for taking the time to watch this video. I'm Father Herge, the pastor of the Catholic parishes of Jackson and Vinton counties in Ohio. Our focus on this video will be on some historical data for Saints Peter and Paul and Holy Trinity parishes. The reason I'm presenting this is we're in the middle of this real presence, real future strategic planning process, and parishioners have been asked to give their feedback to the plans, to the proposed plans, I should say, since the plans are going to be refined based on the feedback, which is due June 30th. Several people have noted to me that most of the data presented for rationale on the videos that the diocese provides are either diocese specific or countrywide, and people were interested to see what the specifics were for our parishes. And so I dug into that and have collected some hopefully useful data. What we need to be clear about, though, is that the data alone do not tell us what we have to do. The data can tell us maybe if one possibility or another makes more or less sense, but what we finally decide to do is going to depend on a lot of other factors. For instance, how much people are involved at the parish, at the parishes, what it takes to actually make a particular community or communities work, and ultimately the salvation of souls in Jackson County, if we're looking at Saints Peter and Paul and Holy Trinity parishes, the salvation of souls is the primary end, and the data only tell us so much. Another thing to bear in mind as we're going through all of this is that we're looking at the history of what has happened, and that is not an absolute determiner of what is going to happen in the future. But what it is useful for is it shows us what has worked or not worked in the past to some extent, but it also helps us put into context our memories of what the parishes were like over the years. It's very easy to have our memory of what things were like at a certain point of time and to have not fully updated them to the current situation. Seeing the trends helps us to give that sort of context. Once again, I'll remind you, the data don't tell us what to do here, but they give us some good context on which to figure that out. So let's get into it. The first thing we're looking at here, every October, we count the number of people who have attended Mass each week in the month of October and average it out. And so we've been doing that, I believe, since the 70s. I've collected that data going back to 1980. And I've divided the number by 10 in here. So you see 30 here, that's actually about 300. What we find is a relatively stable pattern for most of the time up until, well, it's hard to say exactly when things change. For Holy Trinity, there's clearly a more significant decline starting in 2004. Could be that some people started going to Saints Peter and Paul at that time, since we are seeing an increase there. But then a decline starts at Saints Peter and Paul in about 2006, whereas before that time, things were relatively stable over a period of time. This is somewhat averaged out over time. So what this data doesn't show you is quite how steep the drop-off was between 2017 and 2019, which was the most significant drop. So Saints Peter and Paul went from a mass attendance of 190 in 2017 to 136 in 2019. And Holy Trinity went from 146 to 97. And all of this was before COVID started. So one of the things that we're going to be interested in the coming years is trying to invite people who have stopped going mass to come back. Once again, this top blue line is Saints Peter and Paul, the lower red line is Holy Trinity. What we see in here is that, and we'll see this later on, that Saints Peter and Paul has always been the larger parish than Holy Trinity, although we note a bit of an exception in the mid-90s, and perhaps even now too. More recent data is going to show us more. The problem with these kinds of charts we're going to find in every single case is we can't really get as much good information about what is going on now, because these are rolling averages. Otherwise it would be very much zigzagged, and so it's difficult to find the trend. At the very least, we know there is a significant downward trend here. So let's take a look at infant baptisms, or more or less an analog for births. I'm focusing on the last 100 years here. We have more data going back, but I focus on the last 100 years because this is only the period in which Holy Trinity and Saints Peter and Paul have been even remotely comparable in the number of parishioners. Saints Peter and Paul was obviously many degrees larger prior to the 1920s. The other reason we want to look at 100 years is because that covers all of, and in fact even a little more, of the scope of people's memory of what things were like. And so this can tell us a little bit of a story. We can see here, Saints Peter and Paul has the blue line, Holy Trinity has the brown line, that Saints Peter and Paul has generally had more births than Holy Trinity, which corresponds to the historically higher Catholic population in Wellston. What is interesting is that Holy Trinity had a sharper baby boom, and we see that the number of births were going up in both parishes, as we'd expect during that period from 1945 to 1965. But what might be a surprise is that in the last 20 years, for the most part, Holy Trinity has rather consistently had more births than Saints Peter and Paul. This is particularly interesting because throughout most of that time, Saints Peter and Paul has continued to have the larger Catholic population. This might indicate something of a change in trends here for us, but again, remember, this doesn't tell us what we have to do. Now let's take a look at converts. They held up pretty much on the line with one another until the mid-1970s. Then we see a large spike with Saints Peter and Paul converts around 1980. Now, in part, this probably has to do with Father Elefritz, whom I'm told was a very good at bringing people into the church. What it might also have to do with is the changes in Saints Peter and Paul's school to having a larger population that was not Catholic, and then the school drew people in. But the question we might ask ourselves since that point is, if Saints Peter and Paul has had vastly so many more converts since 1980, why is that not reflected in mass attendance or any of the other numbers? And the simple fact is that that probably corresponds with, on the one hand, converts don't have a great track record of staying with the church. I think in general the numbers are that within 5 years, 4 in 5 converts have stopped going to Mass. We can also line this up with a noted trend that parents in particular who have been brought into the church because of the school have stopped being involved with the church after their involvement with the school was up. Next, let's take a look at deaths from the parishes over the years. It's interesting to notice that Holy Trinity has been pretty stable in the number of deaths per year for most of the last 100 years. Saints Peter and Paul has had changes that are presumably corresponding to changes in the population, although in the last couple of years there has seemed to be an increase in deaths, which over the next 15 years in both Holy Trinity and Saints Peter and Paul, we can expect the number of deaths to be going up just because of general population tracking. Now let's look at each parish on its own, comparing the relative numbers. One of the factors that the diocese looked at in assessing parishes was the ratio of births to deaths. When the births line is above the deaths line, that means that the ratio is larger than 1 and the parish is growing younger. If the deaths line is above the births line, then the ratio is below 1 and the parish is growing older. So what we have here, brown line is Holy Trinity births, blue line is Holy Trinity deaths, gray line is Holy Trinity converts, and this red line is 1/10 of Mass attendance. And what we can see here is that since this births line has been above the deaths line, it was there from 1945 all the way until 1990. That means during that time, Holy Trinity was growing. Since that time, deaths and births have been fairly close to one another, which would be fairly consistent with a stable population, which is roughly what we see in the counties. They haven't changed much in population over time. But what's interesting is to compare that to Mass attendance, which has dropped. What this might suggest to us is that Catholic identity has not necessarily dropped a huge amount here, but the connection between Mass attendance and Catholic identity has. So people are still to some extent getting their children baptized, although they are attending Mass less. What isn't clear is what we might see in the future, since a lot of the drop has been recent, and we have been starting just in the last 5 to 10 years to see a decrease in the number of children baptized. What this also is suggesting to us, this data, is that the number of converts we see has to be fairly close to the number of children who leave the church, or children who leave the area This would explain why there has been a relatively constant birth rate. We find another strange situation tracking from 1945 all the way to 2000. What we find is that the number of births and deaths, at least the rolling average for them, at St. Peter and Paul, they almost perfectly tracked with one another. There's no reason that should happen. It's purely coincidental. But this would have an interesting effect. The result would be a fairly constant population for the parish over those years from 1945 to 2000. And people moving away and leaving the church would be filled up with converts coming in. But this chart tells us something, that the constant ratio of births to deaths, it was a stable 1 over this entire period. This chart tells us something more, that the parish has been continually aging since 1960. Because you'll see that although the births and deaths are exactly the same, so the population is pretty much staying the same, the line is declining. The spread between births and deaths that we see since 2000 is only a foretaste of this. Now, both Holy Trinity and Saints Peter and Paul will be, and in fact, the church and everywhere, and the population in general is going to be hit hard when baby boomers start to die. But this trend line is suggesting that it's going to hit Saints Peter and Paul harder. Exactly how can be seen in a later pair of charts that we can look at. When we look at current data for the populations of our parishes, so of particular note are the number of children under confirmation age. 43 at Holy Trinity versus 31 at Saints Peter and Paul. Also of note are the number of registered parishioners who are the ages likely to have children. So age 25 through 44. And what we find is that Holy Trinity, at least on the books, has 43, and Saints Peter and Paul has just 18 by comparison. That is perhaps one of the most significant numbers to note here, because as it currently stands, Holy Trinity and Saints Peter and Paul have roughly the same number of children. Holy Trinity does currently have slightly more, which itself is interesting because historically Saints Peter and Paul has always had more children. This is not true now, and it is going to become far less true in the future. If we look at where things are going to stand 15 years from now, there's the potential for Holy Trinity to have nearly 3 times as many children, just based on the number of people who are in are the ages of people who are having children. But maybe the biggest surprise in compiling these numbers is the revelation that Holy Trinity now has more registered parishioners than Saints Peter and Paul. That has never been true in the history of the parishes. What we're looking at here is a total of 272 registered parishioners versus at Holy Trinity versus 234 at Saints Peter and Paul. Now, obviously, most of these people are not attending Mass, and so the actual reality in the ground is much harder to judge. The rolls will need to be cleaned up as we go through the process of inviting more people back to church. What the chart doesn't show is that adult males at Holy Trinity are more likely to be Catholic than at Saints Peter and Paul. And that's an important factor for the continued religious observance of children, very significant in fact. What these numbers also don't show is that there has been a sharp decrease in the number of children under the age of 10. If we compare in both parishes, there are half as many children under the age of 10 as there are 10 to 18, and that is a significant drop-off. Finally, what this also doesn't show, so we see in the 65 plus category roughly the same number of people in both parishes, but Saints Peter and Paul does have a good deal more people in their 80s as opposed to the 70s compared to Holy Trinity, once again showing a significantly older population at Saints Peter and Paul, as well as if we're going to look into the future and where are the children, they're going to be in Jackson. And that's an important consideration in how we approach the school. Finally, let's take a look at offertory over the years. We have on the left a chart of offertory, just the straight numbers for Saints Peter and Paul and Holy Trinity going back to the early 2000s. And then in the right-hand chart, I have adjusted them for inflation. The decline in inflation-adjusted offertory for Saints Peter and Paul is roughly what you would expect, because it almost lines up perfectly with the decline in attendance over the years. The big surprise is the stability of Holy Trinity offertory, given that Holy Trinity has been seeing a decline in attendance since 2004. But adjusted for inflation, its offertory has been holding fairly steady. What is not clear, so we see since the two parishes were combined together that the offertories start jumping back and forth a lot. You add in the COVID situation, it's difficult to see where the trend will go, but considering population trends, at least short term, we can expect that Holy Trinity offertory will jump up, and then but both parishes are going to end up having to deal with retirement drop-offs in offertory, and so that's a consideration there. I've been going on a lot longer than I intended to with all of this, but I wanted to make sure that you have plenty of time to look at these numbers and let them be context for where we are. Again, I want to remind you, these data don't tell us we have to do anything, but they give us the context for being able to make our decisions about what is going to be best for the salvation of souls in this county. God bless you. I'm going to have a follow-up at some point here with some frequently asked questions.